when you have the social contract, you're a quality company. People always say to me, retail's the worst sector in the world. I say, well, go to the top 5 wealthiest people in the world and tell me how many of them made it through retail. Right? That's why I think it's this interesting idea when you simplify it down to, do we agree on the implicit arrangement or do we not?
Dollar stores have flourished during COVID. They were flourishing even before this time. But even though nothing's a dollar anymore, they understand the implicit relationship that they have to deliver, which is really affordable goods, things that you're looking for, that you're going to go in and you're going to buy because you don't think to go to somewhere else to buy it.
There's value to be had at every stage of a life cycle. The question, listen, I'll use that same idea of, if you know what your value prop is, if you know what you're trying to give, plenty of companies make a lot of money on the back end liquidating all this product with no desire for brand equity, just to move units.
The time cycles are actually compressing. Technology has done that. Companies that used to run for 100 years, and they try to rejuvenate and they try to do things to make themselves look younger, i.e. M&A, acquire young, cool companies to try to reinvigorate. But at the end of the day, there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end, and there's a certain way they need to behave in each one of those cycles to optimize shareholder values.
I think that life cycle approach is the right way to think about it. At what stage of vitality or decrepitude is your carcass at that particular point in time? And you need to think about, how you respond to that. Because most learning in organizations is suspicious. They look and they see something and they build a narrative around it worked because, irrespective if that's the reason why it worked. Then what you see is, well, we must go and do X. We need Agile. We should go buy somebody young. Why aren't we digital channels? And the reality is it oftentimes distracts attention away from the thing that might prolong your longevity.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newberry. I'm a senior executive on call, helping businesses in a make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative, and digital, with thought leaders, experts, and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started. Welcome everybody back to our conversations. I've got Carl, Boutet, Jeffrey Roberts, Simeon Siegel, Roslyn, Griner, and myself, Gary Newberry. We've got so much to discuss. There's so much going on in the environment at the moment, but we sometimes get these little snippets of things. And what's prompted this conversation is the rumour that HBC may be in a run-in to acquire Kohls. And we kind of think, well, that's interesting, but this is a sort of general theme, general narrative that's been going on for quite some time that we were just talking offline about, is it just a rumor? Is there more to it or whatever? So we're going to try and surface some of the issues around this so that anybody listening can start to be a bit more critical or circumspect about seeing a rumor and starting to project from that. So I don't know if anybody wants to kick off on this, but we did talk about, interestingly enough, Carl raised offline the idea of generating a business model from a declining brand, how to do it. And this may fit into this situation.
So let me put things out on the table here. I mean, my first reaction was, holy shit, the blind leading the blind. I mean, that was my first reaction. How can this go well? But then I was like thinking about some comments I've heard recently about what you just said, Gary, is there a new business model? And I've heard, and we have people on this call that are much better positioned than me to validate or put more information behind this, but it's actually a very lucrative piece of the cycle of monetizing the decline of a business. There's ways to pick up the whole thing for a lower price, and then as you pull it apart, sort of taking like a an old car, if you want to go through the trouble of selling each piece of that old car, you're going to get a lot more money for it than just, you know, bringing it to the scrapyard. And there are businesses that do very well doing just that. So is this a new playbook? So I'll let the others on the call sort of speak more intelligently than I could to that.
At the risk of throwing in numbers, because then I get labeled as a number guy. I think there's this interesting dynamic, and I also need to start with rumor in my line of work is a very dangerous word. So I'm not commenting on rumors. I'm not propagating rumors. I'm just talking conceptually about this idea. I think there's this interesting dynamic. There's two things. There's one, the notion of owning your story versus someone else owning it. We're watching department stores. They've lost their own narrative. Department stores are now in the context of conversation. It's not, are they doing better? Are they doing worse? It's, should we spin them off? Should we sell them? What happens to them through someone else's lens? And I think there's a lot of interesting angles to go through that route. But then on the flip side, this idea of thinking through, do we take something apart? Listen, a lot of people have made a lot of money through liquidations. That is absolutely a thing. But at the end of the day, you look at some of these department stores and we can ask, are they actually viable business models, right? We've had so many of our conversations about DTC versus wholesale and thinking about the benefit of wholesale. And what I think we need to remember is just because the media starts talking about vultures circling or lions circling, it doesn't have to be a dead animal. It could be a very healthy animal, right? I mean, this is a weird metaphor I'm going down, but carcasses exist, both if they're healthy or if they're alive.
You're treading on Jeff's naturalist territory here, so Jeff's going to have to step in and give some better animal metaphors than yours.
It's getting them worked out.
I'll give that to you. My simple point is we are now operating under the assumption that if a lot of people are circling, it must be because things are bad. And I think the reality is we have to remember that this whole conversation of did COVID save retail may actually mean there's value to be had. So I'll throw that out there. We'll see where it goes. And Jeff, you can fix my analogy.
No, it was so good. I'm going to steal it and use it as my own later. So I just have that on the record that I've taken that off. It's an interesting one because I think there's, there's not a new activity necessarily, right? So we've seen companies buy, so I think in the UK in clothing, for example, right? So there's been enormous pickup of old clothing lines that carried a lot of heritage value. And the play that you made there was you buy them, you consolidate them, you offshore manufacturing, you throw the label on it, you bring it down from a premium to a mid-market positioning, and there's still cachet in that. So there's money to be made there. I think what's interesting on the department store side, and I really like this concept of losing the control of your narrative, because I think what's particularly interesting there is that in many ways, places that we would not necessarily consider as department stores, I think are more or less supplanting what we traditionally thought of as department stores. So I don't think we'd look at Target and say, so to my mind, Target's a department store, but it's a bit like how we frame Uber as a tech company when in actuality, it's more or less just logistics, right? So they're just coordinating. They're just a logistics backbone to coordinate transportation and things from A to B. So I think it's interesting is that if you're in a position to where, and maybe that's where the value sits, right? Is that there's an enormous amount of value to be able to say, actually, we should be classified as A, which is considered interesting and novel and high value. And then actually, we're not A, even though we do exactly what A is, right? So Target, to my mind, is a department store. If you think about what that works in that space, it has a slightly different layout, a different format that they go through. But I think if you look at it to a category lens, what they're pulling together, how they assemble it, how they merchandise it, where it goes through, there's a lot of things that are there. The carcass looks very similar, I think, to other carcasses that we would potentially look around.
It's really interesting because I think about who would be the right partner, for Kohls, and could Amazon be a better partner? They're already processing the returns, right, of Amazon. They're in the same sort of price bracket of what is sort of the sweet spot of Amazon. That makes more sense to me as Amazon is going in and trying to get into retail, trying to get into apparel. I mean, some of the things that, Kohls had announced during their call was kind of interesting. They were hiring private label designers from Target. So there's something there that, some of the mix is there. I just couldn't see why the Bay was going to be a good partner potentially. But, in the PR business, they say, I don't care if it's good press or bad press, let's talk about me. So you're in the press, you're keeping your name alive out there. And everyone's talking about Kohls right now.
The Amazon Kohls story has been going on since forever. And one of the things that's saving retail right now, or non-Amazon retail, is that Amazon sucks at buying companies. I mean, thank God. Honestly, imagine if they were good at M&A, how much trouble everybody else would be in. Like if they actually knew how to integrate a company and run it and benefit from it, we'd be in a world of hurt right now. So let's just pray so the Kohls thing, to your point, I think is with Amazon would make a lot of sense externally. I think internally they just know how they don't tend to do well, and that would be a big elephant. I mean, they had troubles making Whole Foods at a I don't know what's the scale of Whole Foods versus Kohls, like 1/50th or whatever. They had trouble swallowing that deal. Imagine trying to pull in Kohls. Although they do have that relationship for the reverse logistics, which according to some people is probably driving up to 30% of their traffic, which is really scary. But back to the HBC scenario, the one why I said the blind leading the blind, what I was really, one of the first things that came to mind is Baker's a real estate guy. So, why would Kohls, so coming back to the question, making money on the way down, Baker's specialty so far has been finding groups that have really good real estate assets. You can correct me. I'm not under the impression that Kohls owns a whole lot of their properties. I think everything's pretty much leased. So what that brings me to think is he's seeing something on the balance sheet, or they're seeing something. There's a delta somewhere in the valuation that they see they can pick apart. So it's either the cheap leases that they think they can release, or I don't know if they're sitting on a mountain of inventory that's undervalued. Like there's got to be some other play, because usually that's what Baker does. Is he takes the $1 billion HBC and next day turns around and sells the Manhattan flagship for $3 billion. I mean, that's his play, right? I mean, obviously it was leveraged, so it wasn't a clean $3 billion in his pocket, but that's usually what they see. So I don't know what they're seeing here in Kohls. And if to their much earlier point is this is just all rumors, is there something even to see? So Simeon, you got to own up. Yeah, you got to sort of embrace your numbers here, and that's why you're on this call. Don't think it's because you shaved your beard and you're trying to look like me that you're
I was working on the glasses, here. I mean, Carl, I feel like I got the hair.
You're getting closer, brother. I got you got the styly glasses going.
As you channel others, I'm working to channel you. No, so by the way, I've been playing Lion King on repeat in my head ever since I started talking. You said the word valuation. I snapped back into it. I realized I forgot to say anything about numbers. So what I was intending to say was, since we started doing these chats, the multiples people are paying for retail, the retail sector as a whole, have collapsed, right? The market as well, but within the world, what the valuation, what people are ascribing value and willing to pay has come down materially. And correlation, causation, is it our fault? Is it not? Listen, people can make their own hypotheses, but at the end of the day, when we first started doing these chats, right, last year, the conversation was centered around what can I split off of my own company because I'm going to get a high valuation for it? Do I break apart stores and e-com because people are paying high multiples for e-com? And to Jeff's point, what is considered a tech company was loosely thrown around. Now that multiples are coming down, the conversation becomes who's going to buy something as a whole because it's a value offering. And it's a very important discrepancy. It's a very important nuance. And again, it goes back to the idea of losing control of your own narrative. When things are expensive, you sell parts of yourself. When things are cheap, someone comes in and grabs the rug out from underneath you. And I think it's a very important fact that the market is dictating what we are talking about vis-a-vis M&A or spins. And notice, when's the last time we heard someone pushing for a company to break itself apart? That has seemed to die down, at least in the near term.
I'd like to almost tangent off of what you've just said there, Simeon, about the lower valuations, and just reflect more on a bigger scale than this. And I just wonder how much is in the market for the breakdown and potential continued breakdown of supply chains and international trading condition. We're seeing it a little bit with Russia, and it is literally only a little bit, companies closing in Russia, coming back or just closing their operation and doing something to bring their operations back more domestically. And the big elephant in the room is what might happen if China look at Taiwan and we approach that problem with sanctions, because we're so integrated. We weren't really integrated with Russia, except perhaps parts of Europe with their oil and energy that can sort of grind you to a halt in no time flat. But our whole society benefits from the international trade between North America, Europe, and China. And if we approach that problem, if that kicked off, do you think that there's some aspect of the lower valuations happening now resulting from a Ukraine situation and its implications? And what does that actually mean for retailers who are just thinking this is a local skirmish somewhere else and it won't affect us? We'll still trade with Far Eastern partners. Nothing to see here. Move on.
I think it's even a bigger, I think the problem, so obviously geopolitics and has big implications on valuations across financial sector, not just retail. So I think the markets, and Simeon is again the person to speak to about hate instability. So anytime we're in unstable times, it's gonna make it difficult for any valuation. I think the bigger question, because you already went pretty macro there, Gary, but I think the bigger question in here is, it wasn't so much we're dependent on China or we're dependent on the East. We're overly optimized. We were dependent on one way of doing something because we got it down to such a perfect. And now we're going to blame people like you, Gary. I usually blame Simeon, but this time I'm going to blame people like you because you have basically, that was the playbook. You optimize your supply chain to the single best way of getting this yellow t-shirt to my front door. And that was manufacturing in Vietnam. They came through the Suez Canal, showed up in the port in Montreal, and basically and that was the way. If I want, there was just that one way to get the yellow t-shirt. Boat goes sideways into Suez. Pandemic hits Vietnam. We're screwed. I mean, there's just zero resilience in that. So what is the real impact of that is the companies, and I sit on some boards where this is a very topical conversation, is how do we make sure we don't get caught by a boat that goes sideways on the Suez? I know I've used that example before.
You don't want to have all your marbles in one basket, right? You need diversification of your supply chain and your supplier network, because otherwise people have you by the balls basically. And, you're not in a good negotiating stance. You're much better negotiating stance when you have multiple suppliers. So I think that's really going to be one of the biggest change that people are going to have to go through is, you're right, you can't be optimized to one perfect supplier base and way of routing.
Roslyn, the issue with, I don't want to make that sound like a simple answer, but many organizations are doing that, but then that's only like step 2 of a 10-step plan. I don't know if you caught my article on LinkedIn recently about developing a flexible, agile supply network. And this is a key thing, but it requires us to think very differently about the world and to be able to manage our demand in a much different way so we can actually try and get on the front foot. But our discussion is, sorry, I'm getting off in a supply chain thing. I just want, for this call, I'm not the guy who sits in a warehouse shuffling boxes around.
Sure, Gary.
Blame that gets thrown in other directions.
Sure, Gary.
So yeah, just going back to the potentially declining businesses, how do you kind of exit out of that in some ways and to generate cash beyond what used to happen, let's say pre-pandemic, where there was a playbook which was fairly straightforward, but given that we're entering into a world of even more risk and uncertainty, I wonder how that playbook may have to be altered to still benefit from executing it.
And Gary, how many times do we hear the word uncertainty in the last 2 years, right? Like, I think to keep the Canadian collective viewpoint alive here, the game has to be going to where the puck is going to be, right? You need to anticipate where it's going to be. You can't create your supply chain based on the problems you have today. Right. I think we need to mention it at least once, and then we can move on and check the box. Like, Peloton showed us what happens to a business that builds its supply chain based on its existing demand. And so this notion of pre-pandemic, retail's always been uncertain, but obviously we stopped trying to anticipate the new norm and just woke up to the current norm every day. That makes it very hard to figure out where the puck is going to go. At some point, we have to believe. I mean, I still talk to investors that are like, okay, so as we think about it, are we comparing against 19? Are we at a 3-year comparison now? Are we at a 4-year? Are we going back to 2000? At some point, there's a new base. Retail exists to sell units at a certain price, and that has to be off of a certain base, and then we have to be able to plan accordingly. And so this notion of figuring out whether it's on the way down, whether it's on the way up, we have to we have to allow for the fact that at some point everything can't always be uncertain, because the bet you're making for the future can't be based off of just today. And I think that's the danger. I think that's what we saw, and hopefully we can see where that puck is going. And I think this is really important in terms of what happened in the first half of this year. Listen, none of us obviously could have expected World War III, right? Obviously, none of us could have predicted, well, maybe some of you, but I couldn't have predicted Omicron. What I could have predicted very easily was that we were going to be lapping stimulus and we were going to be lapping pent-up demand. Why? Because it happened 365 days ago. So the interesting part of retail is half of our business is lapping the prior year. Well, the prior year already happened. So what's it going to look? The same way that we should have known this first half of the year was going to be tough. We know that the second half of the year is going to be easier. How? Because if we just take the freight cost right now and flatline it for the rest of the year, then in 6 months, it's below the prior year's levels. So if it goes up, if you have external shocks, yeah, obviously we can't plan for those. But what we do know is assuming constant, right? I like to think about what, both on a macro level and a micro level, if status quo ensues, what happens? Because status quo is supposed to ensue. Does it always? Of course not. That's the uncertainty factor. But shame on us if we can't plan for status quo. It's another factor if there's something else enters the conversation. And that's what I think. The world got negative, valuations got negative, retail got harder when Jan 1 hit. That was pre-Omicron, it was pre-Ukraine. It was because we were lapping a great 1H 2021 was the best time to be a retailer. That means 1H 22 is going to be tough. And it is, but it also gets better. And so that's, I try to think about, so let's step back for a second. Let's forget about all the nuance. And at the end of the day, what do we know? What is the conversation in 3 months, in 6 months, if nothing else changes?
And retail sales aren't going to collapse because, one of the good things about the prior year is there was lots of savings going on in the pocket because they weren't spending their money on travel. They weren't spending their money on clothing. And so there is a pent up demand. So there's not going to be this collapse of retail sales suddenly just because we have Ukraine and, whatever is going on in the world. So I still think people still look through their lens of local versus the global, right? So they still are sort of like, I still want to go on a vacation. I still want to buy a new outfit because I'm going back to the office. So I don't think it's this big collapse. And you're right, you have to kind of plan for what you have, and you do have the insight of what you had last year.
And I think there's an interesting thing here. It's funny, I was talking about this. I feel like I've been caught in an infidelity. I was talking about this on another podcast about.
How dare you, Jeff?
I've come clean. I feel like I've come clean. I've been washed clean. I was talking about this concept of organizational slack. So the idea, whether it's people or processes or systems or attention spans or whatever, so that you've got a bit of capacity in different parts of the organization that you can not only respond to emergent demand, but also it's a site of novelty creation. And so I think this in many ways taps into kind of what we talked about when we were talking about valuations and what do they look like. So if I were to come back to the original point that kicked this off, which was, is HBC looking at Kohls as an opportunity for whatever? So I think if you look at it through the lens of, again, I have no insider knowledge, so I'm purely speculating, is that if you were to look at it through the idea of Slack, for example, you could say, right, is there an opportunity? Is HBC looking at Kohls to say, could we turn this into something else? Is there capacity to basically reform this thing into something new? Or do we just simply bring it into the network? So I think if you look at it, and this obviously plays into whatever they would deem to be an appropriate valuation on it, is that obviously there's the physical aspects of it. There's values pent up in what we think the brands might be worth, but there's also an element of what can you potentially refashion this thing into? And so, I'm wondering that if we think about it through that lens of are they seeing a play potentially, or is it even worth speculating that there's a play to be made there around refashioning, around remaking this thing into something else? I know HBC's had a number of, shall we say, halting attempts at trying to do similar things within their own portfolio. But, I'm wondering if there's something in the world, or even if that's a useful point of reference to think about, when we speculate on how these things are working. And again, getting control of your own narrative. Uber goes if I come back to that one, it's an easy one to frame. But, they go a great deal of the way to make it very, very clear. We're a tech company, we're purely a platform. You look at the regulatory statements, it's always, we're merely an intermediary. All we do is connect A and B. And so I think, is there an opportunity to look at, again, to try to weave these threads back together around reclaiming your narrative by saying, could I refashion this thing into something else because I, as a company, am making this acquisition as part of a refashioning of ourselves?
Tell me when they got their own positioning right. That's what I'd like to know.
Yeah. There might be some other plays that could work that, but I don't think this is the case. And I don't even be a big believer in refashion, quite honestly. I've always wondered if it would be better, and even this comes back to Macy's and these players too. Would, let's say they say, okay, we're going to put $500 million into refashioning, to use your term, Jeff, make Macy's more relevant to the customer. I wonder if it wouldn't be better to take the investors, take that $500 million to start a whole new brand, maybe with, Macy's in the shadows, that's, you know, giving them some supply chain, some coaching, but that it's like, and what would be the, let's, you know, 10 years out, what would be the ROI of that 500 million if it stayed within Macy's and them trying to move the deck chairs on the Titanic, or actually, you know, just saying, hey, we started a VC fund that's basically backing some of the, you know, the cool new concepts out there. Although they tried to do that with Story and pulled in Rachel, and that went nowhere. So goes to show that that formula hasn't worked well for them. But I think that there's a lot of other dynamics in that case. So the whole refashion piece is important. Another topic, Gary, I think that sort of builds off of this, and in talking about implosion that Roslyn, I'd like to hear, because I think it's all part and parcel, is, you know, he said there's no, Roslyn saying it's not going to implode, but I'm curious how we define implosion, because if we're in an inflationary environment that's really like 8-10%, and I've, you know, put this out there a couple of times, I think we're still we're not all macroeconomists here, but, you know, if we're in an inflationary environment that's 8-10%, if my sale, I'm showing year-over-year growth of 5%, I'm sure the CEO will have a way to spin on the call that Simeon's going to be stuck to listen to on the earnings call about how amazing they are to have pulled off 5% year over year in these marketing conditions. But with inflation at 10 or 8 or, you know, 5 in Canada, because we're still measuring DVD and calculator prices apparently to calculate our inflation, what does implosion look like? I mean, I'm not, you know, it's not going to be 50%, you know, Roslyn, it's not going to be 30%, but even still, I mean, we're headed just, you know, preparing for the status quo right now. It doesn't sound like I don't know what that even looks like. I mean, we know we're going to get 6 quarterly hikes, but I mean, apart from that, which is sort of, you know, foreseeable, but if not, what else, how do we prepare for all these different variables, and inflation being one that I think is going to probably be harder on all of us than anything else so far, because it is sort of the combination of all these externalities that we're having to answer to.
Yeah, but, you know, like I say, when you sit in the company, your answer is price increase. You know, let's just price increase. Our base is going to go down, but we're still going to maintain the dollars. We'll still have some growth because of price increase. But for the consumer, I mean, like, interest rates are rising. You've got prices rising. You're not going to be able to touch your true, like, food, transportation. Those are the things that are non-negotiable you have to spend on. It's the discretionary stuff, like, do I take that trip to Europe, or do I take a car and I just go local for my vacation? Do I buy luxury, or do I buy, you know, mid-market? Or, you know, people are going to trade down. So, you know, always the winners in these recessionary times are the low price players, like the Targets, the Amazons, the Walmarts. And I think luxury also stays pretty much good, because the wealthy stay wealthy during these recessionary times. It's really the crunches, the middle class, which is a big chunk of people. So that's where, you know, depends on, that's why I always have trouble with retailers like Kohls, because they're the mid-market. They're not the cheap player, they're not the luxury player. And so those are the ones that kind of get squeezed during this time period, because they're losing the chunk of their consumer who doesn't have the money, the discretionary money to spend.
Problem when you guys talk is just you're dropping so much wisdom that there's like 14 things that are like, you just created like 4 hours worth of conversation. Like, so one thing that I think you both just said, which is so fast, it's getting me thinking about something that I haven't thought about before, which happens a lot, but I'm going to say it. It's probably wrong, so someone can fact check me, but I'm going to say it with conviction, so I'll pretend like it's right.
99% of my day, brother.
Historically, and someone fact check me, this is total conjecture. Historically, inflation starts with price and leads to cost and leads to price. So inflation is a cost input that raises the cost to create something, and therefore prices follow through. This time, it was the opposite. This time, inventory scarcity allowed for retail price hikes. We've had 2 years of price inflation, i.e. the good guy of inflation, without the corresponding cost inflation. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden now, we're seeing a massive delta and a growing delta in the cost side of this conversation. So normally, if we're sitting, Roslyn, to your point, we're sitting in the company, we're saying, oh my God, my AUC, my cost is up 3. Can I price up 2? Can I price up 5? Am I going to, et cetera, as a pass through? Here, you've already priced up 20. And now you're finding out that your cost is going up. And so what I'm seeing that's really interesting, again, if this is wrong, someone tell me, but I would assume that's how inflation has played its course. And that gets harder now, Because in addition to everything we're talking about the macro, in addition to everything we're talking about the world, you've already taken the price. Normally it's supposed to go in the opposite order. And so the customer is saying, well, I'm already paying an incremental 25% higher. It's on you, right? That's why gross margins were the best they've ever been in 2021. So what happens now as we think through, like, how much more room do you have and who has that room? And I guarantee you, and we're all going to agree, it's not universal. There will be certain companies that have structurally lowered their price elasticity of demand and are bear hugging those brand loyalists. They'll be able to raise price. But then there's plenty of others that chase the same units, chase the same price sensitive shopper. And the inflation this time, I think, is completely mismatched.
Isn't it what they say, the remarkable retail can still, price because they have the brand loyalists, and the rest, which are not remarkable.
Are we just dropping podcasts left and right? Is that what's happening here?
Exactly.
Hey, Steve.
This is going seriously meta at this point now. Yeah, I just sorry.
Jeff, we need some more forest analogies here. I mean, we're going deep into the forest here, brothers.
It's a funny one, really, because I think probably what's unusual for most people working in this current environment, because I think it's been 100 years since we've had a war intersect with a pandemic, intersect with all the things that subsequently disrupt those things that lead to, and we saw how that sort of played out on the subsequent 20 years following, at least in Europe. But the interesting thing is that it's in many ways uncharted territory to figure out. Well, not uncharted. It's uncharted for people currently working in this environment. It's not as though we couldn't look retrospectively and say, right, there's an interesting set of circumstances, obviously with a great deal of local nuance, that were very different in the turn of the last century at roughly the same period, where you had the intersection of many of the same large scale events that led to this sort of things. And then how did that play out, and what could we potentially take from that? It's an interesting set out to figure out where are the squeezes going to come, because I think Simeon raises a great point, is the idea is that it was inventory scarcity that was driving a great deal of it before. Mm-hmm. And then I think the problem is not so much that, because if you look at, well, I'll take the US, I put a plug for home, is that if you think about that, the underlying economy itself is pretty robust. You've got great jobs numbers, employment's in the right space. It's still churning out terrific amounts of productivity. And so the question starts to become, can you manage, particularly for listed companies, can you manage investor expectations around what you're going to be able to do? Because we know demand is relatively stable in there. It's figuring out, I think, to Simon's earlier point, we had an absolutely stonking first half of 2021. And that suddenly becomes the new baseline that you have to work against. And so I think it comes back to an earlier point, which was around narratives. And I think a lot of this is managing, if you're inside of an organization, it's figuring out how to manage that narrative to the outside world.
Does it make everyone want to go private again?
So Roslyn, to your point about the middle, so I don't remember if we've talked about this before, but I like to oversimplify this. Like, I think about it as being social contract versus zero-sum game. So at the end of the day, when there's a P&L that needs to be paid, no matter what business you're in. If you're a luxury brand, the implicit social contract is that the customer is going to pay all of the cost of goods. And in response, the company is going to pay every dollar of SG&A, all the expenses. They're going to give you champagne, they're going to have big flagships, glossy advertisement, etc. What does that translate to? Highest gross margin in the business, highest SG&A in the business, highest margins, right? Flows through, best margins. Total other side of the spectrum, the discounters, right? The ones we're talking about, let's use off price. The customer says, I'm not paying a dime of cost, right? You absorb the cost. But in response, I'm going to be your employee. You roll out some clothes on a rack and I will pick, pack, ship, fulfill it myself. Fifth Avenue, no, you give me a warehouse, right? Like, there's no champagne. Hopefully there's no water on the floor. Like, at the end of the day, the response is lowest gross margin in the business, lowest OPEX in the business, and not luxury level margins, but second highest collective margin. So what is that? It's an understanding. It's not this battle between customer and company. It's a social contract. When you have the social contract, you're a quality company. People always say to me, retail's the worst sector in the world. I say, well, go to the top 5 wealthiest people in the world and tell me how many of them made it through retail, right? Like, at the end of the day, the good models that we have, when we know what we are supposed to be on both sides, it works really well. When you go to a place, when you're fighting your customer and saying, you pay the COG, I'm not going to pay the SG&A, and vice versa, right? When you're demanding discounts but still expect service, that's where you get this headbutt. And what's interesting is, more often than not, that barbell's into luxury versus low income, but it doesn't have to be. You can have middle income demographics where there's an understanding of, we know what we're supposed to be. And that's why I think it's this interesting idea when you simplify it down to, do we agree on the implicit arrangement or do we not?
Well, Walmart has a total understanding of their customer and they do it perfectly, as does Target. Like, Dollar stores too. I mean, dollar stores have flourished during COVID, they were flourishing even before this time period. Everybody shops the dollar store, right? So even though nothing's a dollar anymore, they understand the implicit relationship that they have to deliver, which is really affordable goods, basic things that you're looking for that you're going to go in and you're going to buy because you don't think to go to somewhere else to buy it. So I completely agree. It is that implicit relationship of knowing what your positioning is and delivering upon that value to the customer. But talk to me about why, on a totally different topic, is the financials came out on Warby Parker. They have everything going for them. Their sales are up, their customer acquisition is up, and yet they can't deliver profitability. So it just says there must be something, they're spending too much in one area that is not delivering the profitability because they're opening stores, they have technology, they're like a leader in all, they innovated in a category that was kind of dusty. So it's like they should be winning on all sides of the cylinder.
So coming back to trying to make money out of a declining brand, is there any last thoughts around that?
There's value to be had at every stage of a life cycle. The question, listen, I'll use that same idea of if you know what your value prop is, if you know what you're trying to give, plenty of companies make a lot of money on the back end liquidating all this product with no desire for brand equity, just to move units. That's the total other side of the spectrum, like the last stage of life cycle. So I think the message is know who you are, know what you're supposed to be. If you go out of your lane, you better have a really good reason for it. But there are profits to be made at every life cycle. One thing that I think that's interesting with just the department store conversation is, before any activists got involved, we all could have said, is X, Y, and Z company too cheap? We could have said, can these companies make these changes? We didn't say it. But all of a sudden, when someone else throws their hat in the ring, it all becomes a conversation. Oh my God, why don't we? It goes back to this idea of like, know where the puck is going. At the end of the day, nothing has changed, right? Nothing has changed yet at all. There's just speculation around people that can come in and affect change. The company can affect change themselves as well. I think it's an important thing to contextualize. It's always funny to me when things become conversations when the reality is there hasn't been any change.
Because we apparently are in the process of plugging other podcasts, I would encourage you to maybe fascinating, it's actually a conference presentation that was retransmitted on a podcast, but a professor in New York, I'm pretty sure some of you know, Aswath Motorin, did this fascinating presentation at a Pivot where he talked about company life cycles, and he goes, companies are not meant to be eternal. Is within, and what his sort of thesis is the time cycles are actually compressing. Technology has done that. Companies that used to run for 100 years, and they try to rejuvenate and they try to do things to make themselves look younger, i.e. M&A, acquire young, cool companies to try to reinvigorate. But at the end of the day, there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end, and there's a certain way they need to behave in each one of those cycles to optimize shareholder value. What he was stating is he gets worried when he sees an end of life company trying to behave like a startup, because he goes, you're basically just burning shareholder equity. And I thought that was a really interesting observation, which probably sort of wraps this all together, is HBC, which breaks my heart because it's what pretty much created Canada in the first place, for those that
our last remaining department store. It's so sad, other than Simon's, but
exactly, which are not exactly the same type. But all to say that I think you got to know sort of your role, and there's ways of managing each piece of that life cycle, and think about that hard and know and recognize. And you can't blame them for trying to signal to the market that they're not done, that they're nobody wants to signal to the market that they're in decline. There's obviously people that know how to make a dollar doing that. So I think it's time for us to probably acknowledge that.
I can't say much better than these two have. I think it's spot on. I think the reality is that I think that life cycle approach is the right way to think about it. At what stage of vitality or decrepitude is your carcass at that particular point in time? And you need to think about, how you respond to that. If you're going to manage that through. I think that's the ultimate thing is I think a lot of companies, because most learning in organizations is suspicious, they look and they see something and they build a narrative around it worked because, irrespective if that's the reason why it worked. Then what you see is well, we must go and do X. We need Agile. We should go buy somebody young. Why aren't we digital channels? And the reality is it oftentimes distracts attention away from the thing that might prolong your longevity.
I couldn't just said it better, Jeff. But, I want to leave you on a positive note because, last year we were all talking about the death knell of Victoria's Secret. And you know what? They've really turned their business around. So it says that there can be life because they were already in a position of strength in terms of their market share. But now we're talking about the positive, like nobody's looking to buy Victoria's Secret anymore because it's not that cheap anymore. So there are some times where there is a positive sort of ending to the life cycle of a brand where they're able to actually transform themselves in a positive manner. So I like to be the glass half full kind of girl.
On that great note, I think that we'll just bring it to a close. So thanks everybody for tuning in. That's Kohls Boutet, Simeon Siegel, Jeff Roberts, Roslyn, Griner, and myself, Gary Newberry. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.